All right, human geography students, we're going to move on to our next notes section. So you have taken notes on the epidemiologic transition model. We're now going to move on to population movement. All right, so population movement, some important vocabulary for you. People move from one place to another constantly, usually within a small land space. So circulation is short-term repetitive movement that occurs on a regular basis, where migration is a different type of mobility because it involves a permanent move to a new location, either within a single country or from one country to another. So which of the two is going to interest geographers more? Geographers tend to be more interested in migration than circulation, because migration produces important changes for individuals and the regions they move to and from. So think of circulation as like commuting to and from school or commuting to and from work, where migration is going to produce more powerful and long-lasting changes. Spatial interaction is a broad geographical term for the movement of people, ideas, and commodities within and between areas, whether it is circulation or migration. So it's interaction between spaces. The demographic equation summarizes the population change over time in an area by combining natural change, and natural change is going to include death rate subtracted from birth rate, and the net migration. So again, the demographic equation takes natural change and combines that with net migration. Net migration is the difference between immigration and immigration. So there's immigration with an E and immigration with an I. Immigration with an E means migration from a location. So when you are, let's say you are moving from the United States to Switzerland, if you are immigrating with an E from the United States. Immigration with an I is migration to a location. So in the same scenario, if you are moving permanently from the United States to Switzerland, you are immigrating with an E from the United States and immigrating with an I to the United States. Both types of migration usually occur at the same time. So you are immigrating with an E and immigrating with an I in the same move. An important theorist you need to know about is a guy named Ravenstein and his laws of migration. So Ernst Ravenstein, he was a British demographer. In 1885, he wrote 11 migration laws based on his study of internal migration in England, so people moving from place to place within the borders of England. Internal migration is permanent movement of people within a country's borders. Many of his laws are still valid today. They still hold true today. So the first of his laws is that the majority of migrants move only a short distance. So this brings up a vocabulary term from the first unit, distance decay. Distance decay is the decline of an activity or function with increasing distance from the point of origin. It describes the tendency of people to stay fairly close to home. The scale of migration has increased in recent years with modern transportation and communication systems. It's now possible for people to migrate to distant lands much more easily. So think of the time-space convergence. Steppe migration also falls under the law that the majority of migrants only move a short distance. So steppe migration is a long-distance migration done in stages. So an example of steppe migration would be a person or family may move from a rural area to a small town and then later move from the small town to a city. And this results in a long distance migration, but only short distances at a time. So it's kind of like a long migration in baby steps. The majority of migrants only move a short distance. One of the reasons for this is something known as an intervening opportunity. An intervening opportunity describes a favorable opportunity to settle before reaching a destination. An example, migrants from a rural area on the way to a big city settle in a town along the way because they find employment and the conditions are just favorable. The second law of Ravenstein's laws of migration is migrants who move longer distances tend to choose cities and urban areas as their destinations. Most who move leave rural areas and move to urban areas. Currently, many internal migrations within developing countries are from rural to urban areas. For the first time, we are starting to see population trends that suggest that the majority of people live in cities or urban areas now as opposed to rural or more agricultural areas. The third of Ravenstein's laws of migration, you can hear my dogs in the background. So the third law of migration is each migration flow produces a counterflow. When one group moves into an area, another group moves out. So an example of this would be European immigrants moved into cities in the eastern United States. Once they prospered, they moved to better neighborhoods, and then the newest immigrants took over the old neighborhood. The result is that back and forth flow means that net migrations are small, disguising the large amount of movement that is actually taking place. Another of Ravenstein's laws of migration is families are less likely to make international moves than young adults, and most international migrants are young males. And this law has changed in recent years. Young adults now have fewer restrictions on their movements, and historically, women had had less freedom to travel by themselves, but now we're seeing a rise in the number of women migrating because women's empowerment and freedom is becoming much more recognized. So Ravenstein is also related to the gravity model. The gravity model, according to Ravenstein, so it's important because Ravenstein noted the inverse relationship between the volume of migration and the distance between the source and destination. Okay, what the heck does that mean? All right, so basically what he said is that there is a backwards relationship between the volume of migration and the distance between the source and destination. So it's a measure of the interaction of places. And this goes back to the idea of spatial interaction. Excluding migration is directly related to the size of the populations and inversely related to the distance between them. So there's a positive correlation between the size of population, but a negative correlation when it comes to distance. Some important terms related to the gravity model. The first is critical distance. Critical distance is the distance beyond which cost, effort, and means strongly influence the willingness to travel. So the idea that a place is too expensive to move to, or it's going to take too much work to move to this place, or it's just too far away. So there is a point at which something becomes too far away to be interesting to a potential migrant. Critical distance will eventually prevent a migration from occurring. Like a migration is only going to happen as long as financial means allow it, as long as you have the energy to do it, and as long as it's not too far. So this goes back to that positive correlation between migration and population centers. A large city with a lot of employment opportunities, with a lot of people living in it, with a lot of resources is going to have a greater gravitational pull than a small one, meaning that people are going to be willing to spend more money, work harder and travel farther to get to a big city than they would say a small town. So an example in Georgia would be people might be willing to put in the time, the effort, and the money to move to Atlanta, or they might not be willing to put in the time and effort to move to, say, Columbus. So reasons for migrating. Migration can be forced migration or it could be voluntary migration. An example of forced or involuntary migration would be the transport of 10 million Africans to the Western Hemisphere at the beginning of the 16th century. So the Middle Passage and the slave trade are examples of forced migration. Voluntary migration, of course, there's lots of examples of why people would voluntarily choose to move, but primarily a lot of people move for economic reasons because they're just seeking better opportunities. So why migrate? People are motivated by two things. They're motivated by push factors and pull factors. Push factors encourage people to move from the region where they live. They are essentially pushing the person out of their home. Pull factors are things that are attracting people to a new region. Pull factors would be the reasons why you might choose to live in Atlanta over, say, Chattanooga. Migration and reasons for migration are usually a combination of push and pull factors. There's a reason that you're leaving your home, but there's a reason that you're moving to the specific place that you're moving. So examples, economic factors, farmers may be pushed off of land because of drought, because of invasion during times of conflict, or because of landlords. They might move to cities because they have enhanced job opportunities because of industrial growth. So both push factors from the farm and the pull factors of the city encourage farmers to migrate from rural to urban areas. Economic factors help explain worldwide movement of people from rural to urban areas in particularly the 19th and 20th centuries. There are cultural push factors, and cultural push factors are related to a lot of involuntary migrations. So an example would be refugees, and that's going to be an important vocabulary term for you to know. Refugees are people forced to migrate from their homes who cannot return for fear of persecution because of religion, race, nationality, or political opinions, to name a few reasons. Current examples of people who are refugees. You have Palestinians who were forced to leave Israel after the country of Israel was created in 1948, and then subsequent areas were taken over by Israel in 1967. Afghanis fled Afghanistan during the extended war with the Soviet Union that began in 1979. We see a lot of Syrian refugees flowing over the borders into Turkey. We see a lot of refugees from the Middle East making their way to Europe. We have refugees that come to the United States from places like Cuba and Haiti and China and Latin America. Some more examples from history. The Indian subcontinent in 1947, there was a mass migration, mostly based on religion. So when Great Britain walked away from India, India became a sovereign nation that housed two very distinct cultural groups. They agreed to split India and Pakistan away from one another. The Muslims moved and migrated to the newly created Pakistan, and Hindus migrated out of Pakistan and into modern-day India, creating relatively singular states. In Africa, there are refugees because of many intense ethnic conflicts, and examples are, we talked about Rwanda in class, and then we also had the example of Darfur as the genocide in Darfur occurred in the early 2000s, and that eventually leads to the independence of South Sudan. So we have push factors, which can be voluntary and involuntary migration, but culture can also relate to pull factors. So Germany, in the early 19th century, Germans fled the United States to escape fear of retribution from authoritarian government, which was the pull factor. They were attracted to the United States by the democratic government in the United States, which was a pull factor. Eastern Europeans migrated in the 1990s. So the countries that broke free from Soviet control, that was a push factor, allowed citizens to go to Western Europe in search of better jobs, which are pull factors. Environmental factors can be push and pull factors as well. So a push factor, climate, so unpleasant and uninhabitable climates. Elevations. Middle and higher latitudes with high elevations where climate tends to be colder can push people away. Climate pull factors could be a preference for humid and subhuman tropics, subtropics, mid-latitude. So basically, a push factor climate is going to be a climate that is intolerable, and a pull factor climate is going to be one that's going to be fairly moderate and attract people. Pull factor elevations, so higher elevations in the tropics will pull people because it's relief from the heat. So an example of this would be if you visit North Carolina, the Blue Ridge Mountains in the summer in North Carolina, you get a break from the heat and humidity, so that attracts people to that area. Environmental factors, pull factors, sea coasts have typically universally been pull factors. People tend to settle near the seacoast, especially in places like Eurasia, Australia, and South America. You will notice if you look at a population density map that major cities and population centers are going to be clustered on the rims of the continents. Push factors can also include disease, examples from history. So the fall of the ancient Roman Empire included a malaria epidemic. Animal diseases can affect human choices for settlement since people depend on their animals for sustenance. However, in recent history, modern medicine has altered this factor considerably, causing fewer to migrate for health reasons. The environment may create intervening obstacles, and environmental intervening obstacles would be physical features that halt or slow migration from one place to another. Examples can be wide plains, mountains, and deserts. Impacts of major migrations. So major migrations impact both the region that the people leave and the region that is their destination. Examples during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, European migration to the Americas relieved population growth pressures in Europe. So if you'll remember back to previous notes, Thomas Malthus was commenting on population growth in Europe and that the overpopulation was going to create unnecessary strains on the environment. But migration to the New World eventually relieves some of that population pressure. The impact of this European migration to the New World on the indigenous people, on the native people who were already living here, was that the Europeans brought diseases with them and exposed Native Americans to disease that they did not have immunity to and decimated their population. And decimate means severely damage. All right, major migrations at different scales. Okay, migrations occur on all scales from local to global. They can be internal within the country. They can be inter-regional between regions. So example, moving from the southeast to the northeast. It can be intra-regional, which would be within one region. So example, moving within the southern states of the United States. It could be international migration, and international migration can be forced, which is involuntary, or voluntary, in which the migrants choose to move. So global migration patterns are measured with net out and net in migration. So net out migration, so Asia, Latin America, and Africa means that more people immigrate with an E, leave from these places than immigrate with an I to them. Places that have a high net immigration are North America, Europe, and Oceania. This means that more people immigrate or travel to North America, Europe, and Oceania than immigrate with an E from them. People are migrating from less developed countries to more developed countries. That's the basic rule. The largest flows of people in the modern world are from Asia to North America, Asia to Europe, and South America to North America. All right, key points to remember from the session. You need to be able to explain the difference between circulation and migration, the difference between immigration with an E and immigration with an I, the definition of net migration. You need to be able to identify all of Ravenstein's laws of migration, explain the gravity model, be able to explain push and pull factors. How are they different? What are some examples of push and pull factors from history? What are intervening obstacles? And then be able to provide examples of migration at different scales from local to global.